Hi, it's Dennis Daly. There are some great air museums around the country, not to mention the Air and Space Museum, part of the Smithsonian Complex in Washington. And one of the nicest air museums is just south of Seattle. Jim Lemon, a former pilot, was my guide, and I mentioned to him that the museum is so close to the Boeing factory, some people think it's a Boeing museum.
And it's probably one of the things that I'd like to clarify in our conversation. First of all, it's not a Boeing museum, right?
It is technically called the Museum of Flight.
It was the Museum of Flight, and one of the most frequently asked questions that I get here, next to where are the restrooms, is what is that Douglas DC-3, and that's the big blue and white job hanging there in the gallery, doing in a Boeing museum? Now that's a good question. Good question.
Can we walk over that way and maybe
Absolutely.
start the tour? This is somewhat reminiscent, in my mind, on a smaller scale, to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, which is probably one of the most visited of the Smithsonian buildings, if not the most, where you have the aircraft suspended from the ceiling. This is a beautiful plane. As you say, it's blue and white. It has two engines, one on each wing. It's a propeller plane. From what era is this?
Well, this aircraft was designed and built in 1935 by the Douglas Aircraft Company. So this aircraft has been around a long time. During the war, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 of these aircraft manufactured, and they flew for the Air Force under the name of the C-47, and they were more lovingly called the Goonie Birds.
Now, is this then essentially what we in civilian life would know as a DC-3?
Absolutely, this is a DC-3. So again, back to my question is, what is a DC-3 doing in a Boeing museum? And the answer to that is simple, that it's not a Boeing museum. It's a private, non-profit foundation, and it's funded by memberships, by donations and contributions, and the Boeing Company is perhaps the largest and most generous contributor to the museum, and indeed we're very proud to have this association with them. Now, it's a simple matter when we get back to the mistaken identity. We're on Boeing Field, we're in the middle of a Boeing industrial complex, and we have the Red Barn, and that's that building right next door to us. That's the first building that the Boeing Company used to manufacture aircraft in. So why not think it's a Boeing museum?
Absolutely. Now, there's a plane down here on the floor, which is, you look at planes from this era, it's a biplane, two wing surfaces,
Yes, sir.
with the diagonal are they struts or wires? I'm not sure what
They're
to
both. They're struts and
struts
wires.
and wires to hold the wings apart.
Mhm.
And outboarded are two, one on each wing, engines with visible cylinder areas. What do they call the radial engine? I
They're
guess?
radial engines.
In a circle, are positioned in various angles around it, and then one in the middle. Am I wrong? Is this a Ford trimotor?
No.
It's not. It's
no.
somebody's trimotor.
Yes, it's a trimotor, and it's of the era of the 20s, the late 20s, about 1928. And it's a Boeing aircraft, and it was called the Model 80. It was built during a time when the Ford trimotor was in its prime. The trimotor, of course, was an all-metal, cantilever-winged, trimotored monoplane, single wing. Now, you would wonder why this aircraft was built, as you said, with struts, wires, and two wings.
It seems to be a kind of a transition aircraft.
It seems to be. But there was a decided reason for that, and that was to allow the aircraft to operate in and out of airfields at higher elevations in the Rocky Mountain areas.
Two wings, more lift.
More lift, exactly. Landing slow, taking off at slow speeds in short fields. The design of the aircraft was accommodate the mail on the route from Chicago to San Francisco. This was the trunk line that was being flown in those days. Boeing built the aircraft recognizing where it would be flying, and designed it in a manner that would suitably do the job.
Is it safe to say that in the era before the really practical all-metal plane, and I'm thinking here of the DC-3, to carry passengers economically came into being, that there was a great reliance on that subsidy for carrying the mail?
Well, absolutely. First of all, carrying the mail was the first real commercial use of aviation. Prior to that, an airplane was regarded as a tool of the military or an aircraft that the local barnstormers would use to fly around the country and entertain people in. The mail use of the aircraft ushered in flying. Now, how this all came about, quite frequently, the pilots of the smaller aircraft that met this trunk line aircraft on the feeder lines would encounter a businessman or a person who had to be in Detroit from Cleveland or missed the train, and they would offer the pilot a few dollars if they could, get this now, ride with the mail in the compartment with the mail. The pilots would accept this. First, before you know that, the owners became aware of this potential and requested that the designers and manufacturers of the aircraft build a compartment suitable for a couple of passengers. Got that? A couple of passengers.
Extras, if you will.
Extras, right. So the first aircraft that came out to accommodate passengers was what they called a Boeing Model 40, and it was a biplane, and it had a little compartment in front of the mail compartment for 2 passengers. Now, when Boeing put this aircraft together, he built this to accommodate 12 passengers. 12 passengers. Now, this was a real first. He also included in this aircraft a lavatory, and he had stewardesses on board. He was the first person to include the services of a lady in the roles of a stewardess.
So even though I tended to think of the DC-3 as really the beginning of the passenger age, this is a fairly large fuselage on here for the era.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But it couldn't have had a lift without 2 wings. Likely not.
It could have had the lift, but it couldn't have negotiated the high altitude fields, the short fields for takeoff and landing. That's the key. That's what Boeing was looking for. The ability to get into places like Cheyenne, Wyoming at 7,000 feet elevation. All right? And other little tiny fields. Remember, we're talking about the 20s, the late 20s, and the 2-mile stretches of concrete that we're accustomed to using in our 747s and so on were non-existent. They were grass fields, and normally they were fields that were shared by cows when they weren't used by aircraft.
You know, a lot of people who have been perceptive in taking off have noticed that there are markers on runways. I'm counting down the thousands of feet, and I'm used to seeing when I take off from National Airport, the first one I see is barely 6. We have just a little over a mile. I was in Albuquerque the other day, and we get out on the runway, and I see 13 is the first one, and I found out later that the Albuquerque airport shares the runway. Is it Kirkland Air Force Base? And that's an old Strategic Air Command base.
Yes, it is. Yes, yeah. Yes. You're right.
But you're absolutely right. The things we take for granted today, in not only the type of aircraft and even though some people say, oh, I'll never fly again, the luxury of flying. I mean, to me, being up there above the clouds is magic. You were in the Air Force. What did you do? And did you always want to fly?
I always wanted to fly. When I was just a youngster, my goal was to fly aircraft. I can remember riding my bicycle out to the local farmer's field on the weekends, and there'd always be, on a nice day of course, there'd always be somebody out there in an old beat-up biplane with a sign to see your town or see your farm or see the country from the air, and he charged whatever he could, whatever the traffic would bear, $1.50 or whatever. And he'd stuff a couple of people into the front cockpit of the airplane and fly around for a few minutes and land. And this was probably the first ride that many, many Americans had. A ride in an airplane was a big deal. But back to your question of my desires, yes. I accomplished what I wanted to through, of course, World War II. I went into the aviation cadet program in 1942, and I've been at it ever since.
I have an aging uncle who flew over the hump into Burma.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know whether it was in the what we call the DC-3, but I remember him one time, and he still doesn't like to talk much about it, but he said that they were almost wanting to hire the natives to chop the top off the mountains because there were times, he said, if they ever got a downdraft, and you could see the carcasses of the guys who didn't make it.
Oh, yeah, and he's right. It was the main aircraft flying the hump. That was the Burma, China-Burma flights, and they were going over the tallest mountains in the world. Was the C-47, this DC-3 that you see right behind us here, and the old Curtiss C-46, it was called. It was a twin-engine aircraft that resembled the DC-3, only it was larger. And it wasn't quite as a reliable aircraft as the DC-3, and it was a little more expensive to operate, and therefore it didn't enjoy the commercial results that this guy did when after the end of the war.
Pardon my love affair with this plane, this DC-3. I could almost spend the whole show on it.
You could.
Isn't it pretty? There's just something, to my mind, absolutely gorgeous about the plane itself. I don't know what there is. It's just a pretty plane.
Well, it's a marvelous aircraft, and I think its birth is worth mentioning. Is how did it ever come about? Back in 1934, 35, 34. Let me get my numbers straight. The Boeing company came out with a model called the 247. Boeing uses the 7s a lot, the 247. And it was one of the first all-metal, monocoque, cantilever wing, twin-engined aircraft. Very practical, very streamlined, very much at home in appearance to the aircraft we see today. Boeing was flying that aircraft on, I might say, their own airline. Back in those days, Boeing was a consortium of Boeing Aircraft Company, Hamilton Standard Propellers, Pratt & Whitney engines, and United Airlines.
Back to the birth of the DC-3.
Okay, back to the birth of the DC-3. The 247 was a remarkable, innovative aircraft at that time, and everybody wanted to get their hands on it. TWA was flying an old... it was an old world. I believe it was a Yonkers tri-motor aircraft, and basically a wooden fabric aircraft that they had some problems with in a thunderstorm in the Midwest.
Is that the Knute Rockne accident?
Exactly. You're ahead of me on that.
Sorry.
No, you're right. The aircraft disintegrated and everybody was killed. Knute Rockne was a passenger. As you know, Knute Rockne was a role model for many, many children and adults at that time, and this was bad publicity for TWA, correct? Mm-hmm. TWA shopped around to purchase new equipment to gain the confidence of passengers, and he came to Mr. Boeing intending to buy the 247, but couldn't buy the 247 because all of the orders were, all the aircraft were ordered up for a year and a half or more.
And they needed to quickly get their good name back.
They needed it now. TWA went to Donald Douglas and told him his problems and told him what he wanted. He wanted a tri-motored aircraft, and Douglas said, "You don't want a tri-motored aircraft. Let me design you an aircraft that will do the job for you." And he designed what had became the DC-3. It really was. The first aircraft was a DC-1. The production line came out as a DC-2. American Airlines picked it up, and they changed or made a modification to the aircraft to incorporate a sleeper, like a Pullman cars, if you remember the old Pullman cars on the railroad. That became the DC-3. Then every production aircraft off the line after that was the DC-3, and it maintained that name throughout its history.
I mentioned to Jim that I had heard that at one time, to get across the U.S., you actually took a plane and then a train and then a plane and kept alternating.
The plane would fly during the day, and it would land at nightfall or at dusk. the passengers would board a train and get into their Pullman cars and sleep through the night, and at morning they would stop at another point where another plane was waiting for them. They would leave the train, board the plane, and go on their way. Now, this must have been a very tedious trip, if you ask me. How long it took to get across the states, I couldn't guess.
I remember the first time I really flew alone, and it's only been in the past 15 or so years that I've really gotten the bug to fly.
Yeah.
I was with the agriculture department. I was taking short hops. I finally got to Denver, and from Denver I had to go to Los Angeles. And I got on a Continental DC-10 with supper, eating a little steak, listening to classical music on the headphones, watching the sunset over the Rockies. And I thought, my God, I never want to leave this.
It's wonderful, wasn't it? Yeah, but those days are gone forever. You look at it now, we're like a bunch of cattle. Someone told me recently that the word travel used to mean a somewhat luxurious, exciting time in an aircraft.
Now it's travail.
I heard a better one now.
Go ahead.
And that is that we don't travel, we're sent.
Like a package.
That's right, exactly. Really, it's the truth.
Yeah.
I recently came back from Italy. I flew from Rome to New York in a 747. And I wouldn't go on to say who it belonged to or anything, but it was one of the most miserable flights I ever had in my life. I was packed in there like a sardine. Really.
Well, I try so hard to sit on the window for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm so talkative. That's one fewer person I bore to death than if I'm sitting in the middle. I don't have someone on either side. I bring along maps, and if being a pilot, aeronautical charts, and I like to plot the trip because I'm a geography nut. I find it goes that and the crossword puzzles are the way I tolerate aircraft.
Yeah, but that's tough because they're usually flying at such a high altitude. You can't see what's going on under there.
Yeah, but if when we come out of the clouds, though, I have my protractor and my stopwatch, and I pretty well kind of know where we are.
Okay, all right. You're doing dead reckoning navigation, aren't you?
There's a great book, and I'm sure you've read it, that Ernest Gans wrote, Fate is the Hunter, in which he outlines his flying with American, I think, in the 30s and 40s. And it amazed me in reading it how in the days before radar and global positioning satellites, these guys sometimes didn't know where they were, and they had a mountain range coming up. It was just frightening to read some of the things he wrote.
Of course, but you got to remember that the aviation was in its infancy then. When we started flying cross country, maps were not standardized. Maps usually were road maps that the pilots picked up from the local garage or the local oil station, and they were published for Pennsylvania. Had one with a different scale than West Virginia or Ohio or New York.
So in other words, an inch on the map in one state didn't mean the same as an inch in the next state.
Absolutely. And one map might show high elevations, and another map might exaggerate or neglect to show elevations. So it was kind of a hit or miss situation. And then the problem was really magnified when we got into bad weather, or when the pilot got into bad weather. As long as he was flying visually and had visual reference to the ground, he usually didn't have a problem. Usually, all right? Where he got into problems is when he lost sight of the ground. Now he has to fly in what we called a dead reckoning, as you do when you're flying. You estimate the time from a certain point, and you're estimating your your speed, and then it should give you an estimated time of arrival. And that's what the pilots had to use to navigate back in those days. And yes, they did frequently lose their way. As far as radio navigation, the pilots flew the old, you probably have heard the expression of flying on the beam. Well, the beam was nothing more than a radio transmission that actually did send out a hum, a solid carrier. And when the pilot would deviate from the beam, he would either get, in Morse code, an A or an N. Dit-da for an A, da-dit for an N, all right? So now, as I'm on the beam, I'm getting this hum, and I'm hearing it increase in volume as I get to my destination. If I drifted to one side, I'd get a dit-da, and I knew that I had gone right. or I would get the other side and I'd go, da-dit. I knew I had gone left, and I would sneak back and get on this. And this, this was trying. And then this was low frequency, and if there were thunderstorms or anything in the area, the static would drown all this stuff
But
out.
yet you had to listen. I mean, weren't you deafened by the time you got to where you were going?
What'd you say?
We are the guests of the Museum of Flight, located just south of Seattle, Washington, near the big Boeing takeoff and runway test field in that area. And our host is Jim Mellon, a fellow who lived out his childhood dreams by becoming an Air Force pilot in the Second World War and then continued to fly, and now he is sharing his love of aircraft with others as a guide at the Museum of Flight. We walk to another part of the sprawling museum, and there, hanging from the ceiling, is one of the most startling-looking planes ever built. It is the Blackbird, they call it, that high-speed reconnaissance plane. But the model there had an extra added attraction on top, a small little drone, if you will, and Jim Mellon tells me that that was one of the early models that, well, never really panned out in its development.
The beginning of the system was called the A-12, and this came out on the drawing boards in I would say 1959 or 1960, right about that time. And it came about as a result of inadequacy of the U-2. Now, you remember the U-2?
The old Francis Gary Powers incident?
Yes. Gary Powers incidents, that's right. The government recognized that the U-2 was reaching its limits. In other words, technology was reaching the point that it could get to the U-2.
Let me, for young people, explain the U-2 was a spy plane.
Absolutely.
It flew very high and very fast, trying to elude radar, but yet modern-day radar was catching up with it. One day, the Soviets shot one down. The pilot survived. We claim there hadn't been a spy flight. It was very embarrassing.
It was extremely embarrassing, and that was during the Eisenhower,
Khrushchev, yes.
Eisenhower administration and Khrushchev. Well, as a result of that, this is what you see. This aircraft here with a remote-controlled drone mounted between the vertical stabilizers. You see that on top of the aircraft?
Yes.
That's a remote-controlled drone that carries the sufficient intelligence-gathering equipment. Now, the scenario for use of this aircraft was to fly the aircraft to the boundary of the country to be, well, reconnoitered, or whatever word we want to use there.
Spied upon.
Spied upon is a good one. All right. Spied upon. They would launch the drone, and the drone would take off and fly a prescribed course, doing whatever it was supposed to do, taking pictures or listening or whatever, and then it would rendezvous with this aircraft and another aircraft, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules. And this Hercules was equipped with in-flight retrieval gear that had been used in the Pacific to pick up stuff from the space program that came down on chutes. Mm-hmm. They would jettison the package out of the drone, the intelligence package. The package would come down on a chute. The Hercules would scoop this dude up, take it on board, and then they destroyed the drone because there was no way of recovering it. It had an explosive charge in it, and bam, they destroyed it. Now, this then made good Eisenhower's promise to Khrushchev when he said, "Never again will a manned aircraft fly over your country." How about that?
How about that for sneakiness? This little thing on top, the drone you're talking about, is very much out of Star Wars, where they have those pods that they can release from the mothership and go out.
Oh, yeah, isn't it?
It's really high tech.
Yeah, it's a ramjet engine. It requires supersonic speed to get the engine ignited, and then they launch it from this. Now, there were only two of these guys made, two of them. You're looking at one. The other one has been lost because when they launched the drone, it came back into the mothership, broke its back, and we lost that aircraft, the whole bit. One of the pilots didn't survive that, one of the occupants of the mothership. And as a result, I think the realization that it was extremely risky and very expensive, and technically it was rather difficult to achieve.
Probably looked good on paper.
Absolutely. And then subsequent aircraft were manufactured. They called the SR-71s. They were all painted black because the aircraft attains a skin temperature of somewhere near 800 degrees at the tremendous speeds that it flies. A marvelous airplane.
We're here with Jim Mellon at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, right near the Boeing facility. And as we said at the beginning, a lot of people think it's the Boeing Museum. It's not. Jim, from our vantage point here in the center, there's a whole display labeled Apollo, which I presume takes us into the era of space.
Yeah, it does, and that starts back in 1969. It'll give you a chronological view of the Apollo space program. And remember now, 1969, we put 2 men on the moon, right? Then subsequently, there were 5 other flights that landed on the moon, for a total now of 12 men that have actually walked on the moon through the Apollo program. So if you wander through that starts you off with a view of the Apollo capsule, showing the 3 men and how tight they're squeezed into this little capsule, and then the achievements that they had walking on the moon, and then subsequent flights that used a moon buggy. Remember they had this little thing,
the big wire wheels.
Yeah, and there's one sitting over on the corner there. You can see what that looks like. And that would give you a little bit of history of those years, and basically that's what you see there.
Now, there's a plane I want to talk about, and we're going to have to get up and walk to the other side, and that is one of the planes that was an Air Force One during the era, I presume, first starting with Eisenhower. It is, if I'm not mistaken, technically a 707.
It is technically a 707, you're right.
I hate to keep interrupting myself, but here on the left is a beautiful example. There's a large photograph here of a plane with 4 engines, a very high wing, almost a jelly bean looking fuselage, no landing gear, designed to land on water. Can you explain for today's audience, knowing that we take these 2-mile runways for granted, why there were so many of these clipper ships and these water landing planes?
Well, that's pretty simple. There were no runways. Remember, this was back in the 30s. And this is a Boeing Model 314, or more commonly known as the China Clippers, flown by the Pan American Airlines. Pan American was the pioneers of flying the Pacific routes, and this guy was used from flying San Francisco to Hawaii to Japan, to Australia, to New Zealand, and the Philippines, the outer islands.
Well, if you ever had to set down, as long as the seas weren't too rough, you could almost go down anywhere if you had to.
Well, that was the secret behind it. People were very apprehensive about flying a land-based aircraft out over the ocean. They didn't like this at all. So the manufacturers solved the problem by building the aircraft on a boat hull, giving the folks, what I would say, a false sense of security, because if the ocean was rough, they wouldn't last too long.
Forget it. No.
Yeah, forget it.
Was it the fellow's name Juan Trippe, who was president of Pan Am?
Certainly. He was the pioneer of that whole area.
I know there's a marker in Key West, Florida, that says this is the birthplace of Pan Am. It was flying from Key West to Havana.
That's right. That's right. You're absolutely right. And it's sad when you stop to realize that Pan Am is gone.
It's kind of back, but in name only.
Well, in name only.
You're right. I remember we talked about the book Fate is the Hunter. The author saying that if you flew for Pan Am, that was top drawer. When they saw the Pan Am pilots in their starched uniforms and the stewardesses, that was, everyone else was below Pan Am.
They were stewards in those days.
Stewards.
There were no stewardesses among the crew of the Clippers. They were a macho group in those days, believe me.
I'll tell you something. It's unfortunate how we as passengers have relegated the flight attendants from their original role to be there for our safety. Some of the originals had to be nurses, I think, or you wouldn't be accepted as a stewardess. To now we look at them as waiters and waitresses, I'm afraid.
I know it. And it's too bad, but you're right, they were nurses. And that all happened with the Boeing Model 80 that we talked about. Or did I mention that earlier?
Yes, that was the first one, you said.
Yeah, that was the first one to have the stewardesses on board.
Jim Mellon, our guide to the Museum of Flight in Seattle, suggested we go outside because parked there was one of the 3 Boeing 707s delivered to the White House that became known as Air Force One. We stood there, and as he began to describe that plane from the late 1950s, one of the newest Boeing planes landed.
This aircraft came about as a replacement of the presidential
let's
aircraft.
hold on a second. Here's the 777
That's
landing.
right. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful?
Ah.
That's the new 777. Look at that. Watch it.
Now that is a high-capacity, wide-body plane with only 2 engines,
That's
which is
right.
a testament to how much thrust they're getting out of 2 jets now.
Isn't that amazing? Yes. Here I'm going into reverse thrust down there.
Now the 707 is a 4-engine plane,
Is a
two
four.
under each wing, 4 jet.
That's correct. But the advances in the jet engine have been absolutely phenomenal. As you can see, an aircraft that is twice as big as this with only 2 engines, this took 4.
And just for clarification here, that 777 in an emergency situation would have to be able to fly with 1.
Oh, absolutely. That's, you probably remember reading or hearing about the emergency single engine operation requirement that Boeing had to go through to have this aircraft fly more than 180 or up to 180 minutes away from a alternate airfield. And what this means is the aircraft has the capability and the reliability to fly at least 180 minutes. That's what? That's
3 hours.
3 hours away from an emergency field if they lose 1 engine.
And here again, you hit, as Paul Harvey would say, you hit the nail with your head exactly early on when you said that the reliability, the speed, the size that we take for granted today was something that was still in a state of flux and very much experimental when this all started.
Oh, absolutely. The piston engines have been inherently unreliable aircraft engines. Oh, there were good ones and there were not so good ones, but generally speaking, you didn't get the longevity out of a piston engine that you can get out of the turbine engines, the modern jet engines they're using today.
From your own standpoint, can you think of any other occupation that you could have gotten into that would have afforded you the career you had, and now in your retirement years, being able to stay with the love I can see in your eyes of all of this? And can you get me a job here?
It's not a job. I told you
you're a volunteer.
we're
I'm sorry.
volunteers.
Can you get me an assignment here? How's that?
Of course we can. You'd be a great docent here, believe me. No, that's a good question. I honestly have to say that flying was my only love. It was the only thing I ever really wanted to do, and I have achieved that. And I only regret that I can't do it all over again.
Well, you look at the looks in some of these young people around here, and many of these young kids, well, adults too, have never been up close to an airplane, have never looked up inside the wheel assembly, have never been able to touch them
That's
before.
true, yeah. This is a wonderful place to be. It's the only museum that I know of. If you get tired of looking at the inanimate objects inside, you can come outside and watch new 777s land.
Thanks a lot.
I appreciate it, and thank you for asking me.
What a thrill, the Museum of Flight, and also to see an early 777 fly in. That was nice. I'm Dennis Daly.